cares?
Like what is
Just a
happening
little
here?
movie. You know?
What's happening here?
Here is, I'm practicing for the, never mind. Okay. You got the movie. Yeah. This is my audition tape.
Well, let's see it.
But anyway.
This is Ace Ventura. This is when you're in Africa.
This is when I'm driving. Of course, Ace is famous for his driving, and you know, I had to keep the flame burning on this. And so,
let's take a look.
Yeah, basically, this is me driving. You pretty chitty bang bang, chitty chitty bang bang, we love you. And our pretty chitty bang bang, chitty chitty bang bang loves us too. Hi, everywhere we go, our chitty chitty weedy pants. Bang bang, chitty chitty bang bang, our classmates and their friends. Bang bang, chitty chitty bang bang, our 5-4 standard. Chitty bang bang, chitty chitty bang bang, chitty bang bang, yeah! Oh, thank God! If I can just find a parking spot! Perhaps we should throw down at the teensy-weensy bit? Nonsense, poopy pants! We're going to Big Park! Really? Look out!
Gentlemen, Jim Carrey, you're right back with Tom Jones right after this.
right, I'd like to bring in Caroline Coulthard. She is a very close friend of the Patten family. Tell me, Caroline, what is Mr. Patten thinking right now? What kind of emotions are going on? We saw his daughters, and they were obviously very emotional.
I'm sure as he was handed the Union Jack by his ADC there, with the strains of God Save the Queen going on, he must have longed to have just fallen through the floor. You know, he's grown to love the people of Hong Kong, and although he's had a very difficult time from a political point of view, in other senses, he's had a very interesting time, as he often says.
Tell me about Governor Patten behind the scenes. What was he like when he wasn't in the spotlight?
I think he's an incredibly caring man, a very spiritual man, and I think without that spirituality, he would have found the strain of the relationship with China impossible. And he's a very close family man. He has a wonderful wife and a supportive family.
And it seemed that the people of Hong Kong did like him because he was more personal.
Oh, yes.
He tried to reach out to the crowds. Was that real?
Oh, very much so. I mean, in one of his early district visits in 1992, somebody shook his hand and said, I like your car, I'd like to have a drive in it. Which he said, of course. Which it was then organized, the car was sent for him, for, say, Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong then was taken in the Daimler to Government House, had a cup of tea with the governor, and then taken back to his housing estate. So he was very much loved and respected by the people of Hong Kong, the grassroots of Hong Kong.
And now the governor's car is circling the driveway 3 times, which is traditional. And he will be heading to Tamar to watch the ceremonies, the farewell ceremonies there. What is the tradition behind?
What, the 3 times round?
3 times round the drive.
I think it's to ensure that the governor will come back.
So it's a way of saying so long, but maybe I'll be back.
Exactly.
And for him, leaving Hong Kong behind, is he happy? Is he proud of what he did? Does he wish he could have done more? I'm sure he wishes he could have done more. He's a perfectionist, I'm sure. But I think he is content in knowing that he's left Hong Kong in a very strong economic situation. Democracy is coming in, the rule of law is here. And I think he is positive for the future of Hong Kong and hopes that it will continue to be a great success, which I'm sure it will. Caroline Coulthard, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And CNN International will continue our coverage of this live event. CNN Domestic will return to Newsroom. We'll be right back.
Oh, Lord.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cassandra Henderson, and welcome to this abbreviated edition of CNN Newsroom.
And I'm Tony Frazran. Now, in just under 8 hours, it will be midnight Monday in Hong Kong.
The Chinese call it 0 hour. It's the moment when control of the British colony reverts to China. Now, only just a moment ago, Hong Kong's outgoing British governor said goodbye to his staff.
The British flag was lowered one last time over the governor's mansion. Now, Hong Kong is a progressive Western society, a center of international trade.
So there is worldwide interest and concern about how it might change under Chinese rule.
Just over 6 months ago, a Beijing-backed committee picked its future chief executive of Hong Kong, shipping magnate Tong Chi-Hua. Finally, he said, "We are the masters of our own house." In January, Hong Kong's government-in-waiting began holding weekly meetings just across the border, passing and debating new laws for Hong Kong. This legislature also is Beijing-appointed. It replaces Hong Kong's democratically elected lawmakers who held their final session Saturday. Tong Chi-Hua indicates there will be elections for a new legislature next May.
Democracy activists have already begun protesting, concerned about what freedoms will remain in Hong Kong, such as the right to demonstrate in the streets. Tong told CNN,
"Lawful, peaceful demonstration will be permitted in Hong Kong. Demonstration is part of our culture."
But he also said the new legislature will pass a law giving police greater powers to stop demonstrations. A couple hundred Chinese mainland troops are already in Hong Kong. In a few hours, they'll be joined by 500 more soldiers. China wants them in place to begin their new duties at the moment the handover takes place. Then, just 6 hours later, another 4,000 Chinese troops will arrive, by sea, air, and land, including armored military vehicles rolling through the streets of Hong Kong.
Now, that's just totally insensitive for those armored personnel carriers that were present at the terrible events of Tiananmen Square. And immediately that raises problems with us.
But after 156 years of colonial rule, the British will no longer have a say in the policies of Hong Kong.
I very much hope that they will start to concentrate after the 1st of July on continuity and perhaps talk a little less about change.
This past weekend, there were a number of bittersweet tributes to departing British Governor Chris Patten and the British monarchy.
There will be more tributes and celebrations after the handover for the Chinese government. And perhaps there'll be answers to the big question. Will communist powerhouse China change capitalist giant Hong Kong?
Hong Kong has an important mission, that is to show the world that one country, two systems can really work.
Britain's claim to Hong Kong goes back to the mid-19th century when China and Britain clashed in a series of infamous conflicts known as the Opium Wars. Newsroom's Jennifer Prelow explains how those battles shaped Hong Kong's entire future.
Hong Kong, a tiny territory in the South China Sea, off the coast of mainland China, with a big city and a booming economy. An economy sparked by British traders over 150 years ago. Then, Hong Kong was just a barren island, but the British saw its harbor as an ideal haven for its ships, and a gateway for expanding trade with China. And expand they did. They brought over opium, an illegal and highly addictive drug, and smuggled it into China. But when the Chinese tried to stop the British, several conflicts broke out, known as the Opium Wars. The British won the first Opium War in 1842 and claimed Hong Kong Island as their own. Later, they obtained Kowloon Peninsula and the New Territories, all which make up Hong Kong. It became a British colony on Chinese soil. In 1898, the Chinese leased Hong Kong and surrounding territories to Britain for 99 years, and now that lease is up. China has always maintained that the treaties which brought Hong Kong under British rule were unjust. And when the end of the lease was nearing, the British decided to negotiate terms for returning Hong Kong back to China. So in 1984, Britain and China signed a joint declaration, officially returning Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty on July 1st, 1997. From this date on, Hong Kong will become a special administrative region of China under Chinese rule. But the deal promises Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy. It will keep its current freedoms and a capitalist system for the next 50 years. China's socialist system and policies will not be applied to Hong Kong. And Chinese officials say there will be one country, two systems. Despite their shared Chinese heritage, people in Hong Kong and China are worlds apart. While people in Hong Kong enjoy basic freedoms, people in China are part of a closed communist society, which the world community has criticized for restricting individual rights. In 1989, Hong Kong trembled when China's tanks crushed the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square, destroying confidence in China's pledge to preserve democracy in Hong Kong. When China takes over, Hong Kong's elected legislature will be replaced by an unelected Chinese-appointed body, which again raises questions about China's commitment to preserving current freedoms. Despite the controversy, people in Hong Kong will be celebrating, but there are mixed emotions.
I think what most people don't understand is that Hong Kong needs China just as much as China needs Hong Kong.
When the sun sets behind Hong Kong's skyline, 156 years of British rule will come to an end. But a new chapter in Hong Kong's history books will soon begin. Jennifer Prelow, CNN Newsroom.
CNN recently surveyed Hong Kong residents about their expectations for life under Chinese control.
Well, it is tough to predict what the handover will mean for the future of Hong Kong. And even though China's president promises to preserve many of Hong Kong's freedoms, a lot of people think that promise is an empty one. Mike Chinoy explores Hong Kong's somewhat cloudy future.
Nothing like it has ever happened before. The brashest capitalist society on earth being handed back to the world's most powerful communist state. The 6 million prosperous, well-educated, cosmopolitan, and free people of Hong Kong will, on July 1st, become citizens of a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. It is an unprecedented experiment, and the formula that is supposed to make it work consists of just 4 words: one country, 2 systems. It was a formula devised by the late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, and it commits China to allow Hong Kong to maintain its capitalist way of life for 50 years after the handover.
Under the concept of one country, 2 systems, Hong Kong will be moving forward with a great deal and great degree of autonomy. And for the first time in our recent history, Hong Kong people will be ruling Hong Kong. We will be truly master of our own house.
Yet as July 1st approaches, the genuine sense of nationalistic pride many Hong Kong residents feel at the end of British colonial rule is tinged with anxiety, the fear that Beijing may not keep its promises.
People have taken the slogans, one country, 2 systems, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, high degree of autonomy and stability and prosperity. They've taken those slogans as promises, but they have certain things that they're concerned about, certain freedoms, economic freedoms, and political freedoms.
But there are clear signs these freedoms may be in jeopardy. On July 1st, Beijing is going to replace Hong Kong's current democratically elected legislature with an appointed one. Among its first acts will be to roll back key laws introduced in recent years by Governor Chris Patten to protect civil liberties.
I wish they wouldn't give the impression that they want to see Hong Kong governed according to the sort of struggle concept of Marxist-Leninism. They should stand back from Hong Kong. They should let Hong Kong get on with its way of life, but they really mustn't risk stifling Hong Kong through being absolutely obsessed with controlling everything here.
Economically, the prospects are rosier as Hong Kong continues to boom and to benefit from China's ongoing boom. But here, too, there are worries.
People increasingly are going to be concerned about doing business here in Hong Kong. You're going to have to be concerned about the rule of law here, that you're going to have to be concerned about being brought before a local Hong Kong court. You're going to have to be concerned, if you're in the financial services community, about the free flow of information in the face of potential press censorship.
For all the problems, China has an immense stake in making the Hong Kong experiment work as a matter of national pride, to inherit Hong Kong's wealth, and to pave the way for the eventual reunification of mainland China and Taiwan. But as the Union Jack is lowered for the last time and the British Army beats a final imperial retreat, questions remain. Will the Chinese keep their word? Will the people of Hong Kong keep their freedoms? Will the handover mark the end of Hong Kong's spectacular success story or the start of a glorious new chapter? Mike Genoy, CNN, Hong Kong.
Well, in just a few hours, the eyes of the world will be focused on Hong Kong.
And for millions of Chinese who live outside of Asia, the events in Hong Kong cast warrant especially close watching.
Newsroom's Charles Tsai went out to the Chinese community in Atlanta and found a mixed bag of expectations.
Not too many Chinese Americans choose Atlanta as their home, but the 50,000 who did have turned this stretch of highway into a vibrant business center. It is in one of the many restaurants here that we sat down with 4 overseas Chinese to talk about the Hong Kong handover. CNN did a poll recently, and it showed that Hong Kong people are very much divided over whether the handover is a good thing. Do you think there's a similar division here in the Hong Kong Chinese community, Mrs. Luck?
Yeah, exactly. Like me, I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I received my basic education there. So I really understand the feeling and emotions of the people from Hong Kong.
Are you happy or sad about the handover?
I could say like 2 things. One is celebration, but I got a reservation and concern.
What concerns do you have?
It's concerned about if the Chinese government, they really could keep their promises, like a hand-off policy, and also the one country, 2 systems policy.
I see. Lawrence Lowe, you will be going back to Hong Kong after your studies.
Right.
What do you hope to find when you go back?
I think by that time in Hong Kong, there will be like more business, like even maybe like foreign business over in Hong Kong, because I think before in Hong Kong, we're like colony, and right now we're back to our motherland, and China got more like resources and everything. I would expect that there would be more jobs and everything over there would be much better than right now.
So you think in general this would be a good thing for Hong Kong people?
Well, personally, I think that's a good thing for everybody in Hong Kong. I mean, why would we want to be in a colony, rather than going back to motherland, another country?
Mr. Guang, you have lived under Chinese communist rule for much of your life. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, for this, I would say I myself has both sides of mixed feelings. Kind of chapter of the shame of Chinese history is closed at this moment. But I do also share a lot of concern that my next person shares the same thing about the Chinese government promises about freedom, about democracy towards Hong Kong, and whether they can keep this, and whether the one country, 2 systems going to work, and this is really started putting into test.
Do you think if the Tiananmen Square crackdown never happened, if the Chinese troops didn't crack down on protesters in Tiananmen Square, that there would be...
That's the reason we feel very frustrated.
You think that might happen in Hong Kong?
I hope they got that, they experienced that, and they learn from mistakes.
I mean, everybody may do something wrong in the in the past. I mean, look at Japan, look at like Hitler and all those stuff, But I think it just takes time to learn from mistakes and everything. And after all, and I do think that they really be much more careful about political issues like that, from now on. So I really, personally, I don't think that's going to happen in Hong Kong.
Mr. Wong, after the Hong Kong handover, Taiwan will be the last part of China that is not under Beijing control. What do you think Taiwan people feel about this handover?
I think from historical point, we're really happy for Chinese. I don't care for what kind of regime we under, is communist regime or democratic regime. Hopefully, the Communist China take over the Hong Kong. They will keep the momentum going, not only just good for Hong Kong, but good for China and good for Taiwan. I think eventually, if the 2 systems will be close enough, I think a reunification is very, very, very possible. But if the way they go backward, go to like Tiananmen Square, that kind of stuff, then everybody have a really reservation on what they're going to do.
Do any of you think that the fears about this handover are overblown?
And I think the Western's concern sometimes a little bit based on the old image of the current China, which what they have is some of them probably in 1989's image of what China was. And some of the people, I believe, they still have a 1960s China's concept and evaluate it now. So even though they are still under communist, quote unquote, but their communism is so much different than what is in North Korea or in Cuba.
Even 30 years ago,
right,
different.
So it's not the same anymore.
We all try to look at the bright side. Just like in history, Europeans used to say milking the Chinese cow. Well,
Milking the Chinese cow?
Yeah,
milking the Chinese cow. Right.
It means like they got lots of profit from the economy. But right now it's a reasonable time to hand back to China.
I would suspect that the handover would not have the same significance to the younger generation of overseas Chinese people. How do you explain the impact and meaning of this handover to the younger generation who grew up maybe in the U.S., Mr. Wang?
Like I have two boys, they are in Georgia Tech. I try to tell them this is very big event for us, meaning Chinese. They said they don't understand. I said, well, just realize, like the Colombia try to sell United States cocaine right now, and somehow United States said, no, you can't do that. Then we had a war with Colombia, and we lost the war. And they take, not only they can sell the drug, and they take California away from us. How do you feel?
100 years.
That's right. They say, oh yeah, that's not impossible, but yes, that's what happened to Hong Kong and China. So for us, I mean, of course, I'm the first generation, so I have a much more emotional tie to China rather than my kids. They all grew up here. But I think they understand why we have so much sentimental feeling about this issue than the second generation. I think they do understand now why we so celebrate the event.
Well, stay tuned to CNN for more on the events in Hong Kong.
We conclude our special coverage with Hong Kong sights and sounds.
Live in Hong Kong, where clouds and rain have done little to dampen emotions in the last handful of hours before Hong Kong's handover to China. Hello to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. It's 7 hours before the change of power, but history is already being made here in Hong Kong. Colonial Governor Chris Patten has just said his farewells at his official residence called Government House. The Royal Navy is leaving its post in Victoria Harbor after standing sentinel for 156 years. And the People's Liberation Army of China gets its final orders before crossing the border into Hong Kong, starting even before the handover in about 4 hours. We'll stay with CNN in the coming hours for extensive live coverage of the handover. Now, a 1-hour look at Hong Kong yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Chinese officials, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright warned China it will be judged by the way it handles Hong Kong.
Hopefully, these leaders will understand that the Hong Kong of tomorrow must look like the Hong Kong of today.
The change everyone fears are the Chinese soldiers who this morning got a big send-off from just across the border. Just how these troops are used will likely be the first indication of what Hong Kong's future will be under the Chinese flag. That flag will be flying here in just a few hours, and the Chinese troops will be making their way across the border. All of this will belong to China, but the challenge will be making it work for them without destroying what the British have created here. Nathan Thomas, ABC News, Hong Kong.
In China's Tiananmen Square, a giant clock counts down toward midnight and what Chinese officials are calling the reunification with Hong Kong. ABC's Deborah Wong is in Beijing right now. Good morning, Deborah. We have a lot to talk about in a short amount of time, but let's talk about the celebrations that have been going on there over the past weekend.
Well, it's been an extraordinary couple of days. There have literally been hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets the last few days. People have come from all over the country. They wanted to be here to celebrate. They've been on Tiananmen Square just crowding around, looking at the decorations, looking at the countdown clock that's now counting down towards midnight tonight. You hear people constantly saying that this is the biggest event that they've ever experienced in their lifetimes. They wanted to be here in the capital to experience firsthand the making of history, essentially, and it's a very, very big deal for China today.
What's going on right now? Now, I understand you were in Tiananmen Square earlier, but have people been moved out of that area, perhaps for security reasons?
People have been moved out. I mean, there were crowds there until about an hour ago, and security police are now conducting a sweep of the square, which is right behind me. I don't know if you can see it. The main event will be there tonight for about 100,000 invited guests, and it's going to be a big celebration, fireworks, song and dance performances. They'll have big television screens so that they can actually watch the events that happen in Hong Kong as midnight approaches. And all of these people, all these tens of thousands of people were unfortunately pushed out of the square. They weren't very happy about it when it occurred.
No, I can imagine they weren't. Real quick question about this will be on television, correct? Chinese television?
This will be on TV, and actually people are being urged to stay at home and watch the event on TV. They don't want huge crowds of people pouring out into the streets. It just poses a sort of security problem for Chinese police. They like to keep things orderly.
Yeah, yes, we know that. All right, thanks so much, Deborah. Deborah Wong reporting for us from Beijing. Peter Jennings is in Hong Kong, and he'll anchor a special edition of Good Morning America beginning at 6:45 on the East Coast. And Peter will lead ABC's live coverage of the handover of Hong Kong starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, as the deadline for Hong Kong's turnover approached, Hong Kong businessmen increased their investments in U.S. real estate. According to a report from the accounting firm of Ernst & Young, almost half of the $6.3 billion invested in the U.S. from Asia over the past 3 years came from Hong Kong. The study says Hong Kong investors view the U.S. as a stable market. Okay, moving on to other news right now. Mike Tyson.
Now, Hong Kong has, of course, long been a center of world commerce. But the question on many people's minds today is just what this handover will mean for international trade. CNBC's Felicia Taylor joins us now to explain. Morning, Felicia.
Good morning.
Now, we know that China agreed to the principle of one country, two systems. But can China really accept the democratic ways of doing business in Hong Kong?
Well, that's exactly the goal. We're not going to know the reality for another 2 to 3 years. But China already has a strong manufacturing base. That's thanks to cheap labor, so that's a good sign. We don't know, though, if communist China will allow the freedom a democratic society takes for granted. That, of course, is going to impact business. As you just heard Ms. Albright say, the arrival of 4,000 troops, not a good way to start.
A little unnerving. So what economic changes are we likely to see in the short term?
Well, the good news is that any change is going to come pretty slowly. Hong Kong is not going to be subject to Chinese law, and it's going to retain its own currency. You can bet the world's going to be watching closely to make sure China doesn't renege on its promises. If it does, the U.S. has already said it's going to take back Hong Kong's trading privileges. Let's face it, though, China needs Hong Kong to stay prosperous. Chinese companies are dependent on setting up shop, literally, in Hong Kong in order to be successful.
Indeed. Okay, one last question. How will this affect the investing in the region?
Well, up until now, mutual funds that invest in the region haven't done that well. Some call that opportunity. Get in before it gets expensive. One analyst isn't worried about political repression and says the process of transition really began back in 1984. As you pointed out, the history says that if anything was going to go wrong, it would have by now. The Hong Kong stock market as of Friday hit a record high. And the so-called red chip companies, those with Chinese roots, have climbed about 35% this year. And as you well know, the U.S. market has had a great run. But listen to this. Over the last 20 years, the Hong Kong stock market has increased 60 times. That's from a level of 200 in 1973 to 13,000 last week. The Dow has increased about 20 times over the last 60 years.
Okay, thanks very much, Felicia. CNBC's Felicia Taylor. And we will have more news in just a moment. Stay with us. Its colonial crown and giving it back to China. Hong Kong has enjoyed wide freedom and a booming capitalist economy under Britain's rule. But at sunset over there today, the British governor, Chris Patten, said farewell to his staff and left his residence. Right now, with a time difference, it's evening in Hong Kong, and as midnight approaches, the time of the official handover, we will see the end of 156 years of British rule. The occasion will be marked by what's being called the largest fireworks and light show in history. At the same time, similar festivities are taking place in China's capital, Beijing. NBC News and MSNBC will provide live coverage throughout the day. Meanwhile, for 13 hours to implode an old sugar refinery. Success finally came after bulldozers toppled pillars and crews used hundreds of pounds of explosives. Now, city officials are investigating the demolition firm. Wonder why. It's Monday, June 30th.
The ending has begun in Hong Kong. The handover of power from the British to the Chinese is just hours away now. Our Tiwa Chang has a live report this morning from Hong Kong.
Which means that after 156 years of British colonial rule, it's handed back to the Chinese today at midnight Hong Kong time and 12 noon our time. And as we said, we'll have a live report from Tiwa Chang. Also, interestingly, in the Post,
Britain is returning the island in a much different condition than it received it from China 156 years ago. Well, ABC's Mark Blitke on why Hong Kong is such a celebrated place.
It's one of the noisiest, most garish, overcrowded cities in the world.
And you can learn a lot about this place just listening to what its people like to brag about.
Hong Kong people boast that they're the world's biggest gamblers at the track, wagering $10 billion annually. That's $1,700 for every citizen. And win or lose, they're the biggest brandy drinkers in the world, importing 10 million bottles last year. Expensive doodads, nobody buys more of them, especially the ostentatious variety. Hong Kong has the world's highest per capita ownership of Rolls-Royces. For a city with such expensive bragging rights, Hong Kong does boast of a few bargains.
This is the Star Ferry, which Hong Kong people like to call the best value for money tourist excursion in the world. 5-minute ride across the harbor for about 25 cents.
Of course, it's often the only way to go when you have the highest traffic density in the world. But nothing gets in the way of doing business here, so this is the world's mobile phone capital, one for every 4.8 people. The highest ratio of restaurants to people, the largest floating restaurant, the largest restaurant period, with seating for 6,000, serving the world's squiggliest, slimiest, most unique cuisine. But Hong Kong must be doing something right. It's tied with Japan for the world's highest life expectancy, 79 years. Even the world's oldest rickshaw puller is still going strong at 84. Mark Litke, ABC News, Hong Kong.
All right, coming up on Good Morning America, more on Hong Kong and more on the Mike Tyson Evander Holyfield fight. Or should we say bite? That's news for this half hour. Thanks for joining us.
You're watching ABC.
The 6 ABC Sunoco Welcome America 4th of July celebration Friday.
Action News, Delaware Valley's leading news program, with Cecily Tynan, Rick Williams, and Monica Malpass.
Good morning. It is 5:30 on this Monday, June 30th. Rick is off today, and David Henry joins us on Action News this morning. A building with a mind of its own comes crashing down to earth.
A tree falls on two people as they walk along City Line Avenue.
And an historic inn becomes a mobile home for a day.
All right, Monday morning. Hope everybody had a nice weekend. Good morning to you.
Good morning. It was a beautiful weekend weather-wise.
Magnificent.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
nice.
And today we have another beautiful summer day. My job is easy today. This morning we have just a few high clouds around. Right now in Philadelphia, officially reporting high clouds, 66 degrees, pretty mild. And AccuWeather says going to be mostly sunny. Yesterday's high 88. Today I think we'll take it down a notch to 86. Low humidity, gorgeous, but we are looking at the possibility of some showers later on this weekend. We'll check that out coming up in the AccuWeather 5-day forecast.
All right, good. Thank you. First in the news this morning, a wrecking crew kept trying, but the old Jack Frost sugar refinery refused to budge. More than 12 hours and several attempts later, the factory came tumbling down on its own. Action News reporter Kristen Z was there when it happened.
At exactly 9 o'clock, the building collapsed without warning. As the bricks, concrete, and steel succumbed to gravity, monstrous dust clouds swept over the area. It was a blackout on Delaware Avenue. The dramatic conclusion comes after repeated attempts to take down the building. Cables wrapped around the columns snapped as bulldozers pulled on them. At 7:30, a few bricks fell. Close to 8:30, bigger sections tumbled and the building began splitting. But just as the spectators were getting bored and the frustrated contractors were wondering what to do, the structure collapsed. L&I Commissioner Fran Egan was among the 10 people standing just 100 feet away.
We heard it start to rumble. We all started running because it was just going down and the smoke was coming at us. And we just, took off.
Police, fire, city officials, and spectators all were caught by surprise. So you were scared?
Well, certainly. Sure. It's not every day that you get to see a 10-story building coming your way in a cloud of smoke.
I was scared. I thought it was going to hit us.
Luckily, no one was hurt. Looking at the collapse again, you have to wonder why the building didn't come down sooner. The Florida-based contractor and its Iowa-based implosion team were unavailable to answer questions that the city will be asking in the coming days. Another question is, what about the adjacent Jack Frost building that's scheduled to come down in August? The same contractor is supposed to do the work, but city officials say the contractor will have to answer lots of questions before that project can proceed. Kristen Z, Channel 6 Action News in Fishtown.
Well, the old Jack Frost Sugar Refinery was originally scheduled to have gone down earlier yesterday morning. Contractors were becoming frustrated after repeated efforts to bring down the building failed. The first blast happened around 8 a.m., but the building stood firm, so demolition crews tried again about an hour later. The old refinery still didn't budge. Onlookers were starting to take bets on how long it would take to bring the structure down.
Taking bets. 2-1, it won't fall.
When the building still refused to come down, crews wrapped a cable around its support columns and attached it to a bulldozer. The first time, the cable broke. The second time, still nothing. It wasn't until some 12 hours later that the stubborn structure decided to finally give up the fight.
In other news,
We'll have a live report on Hong Kong handover coming up in our next half hour, so stay tuned for that.
But when the historic handover to China is complete, people in Hong Kong hope for continued prosperity. But with those hopes are anxieties over keeping the personal and religious freedoms that are already in place there. Hong Kong's incoming chief executive is promising to honor all current policies.
Hong Kong is going to go forward under one country, two system principle.
The handover treaty, signed in 1984, states that all present policies will remain unchanged for 50 years. Meantime, foreign VIPs are now arriving in Hong Kong for ceremonies giving the colony back to China at midnight Monday, and that's noon here in Philadelphia today.
Good Morning America is providing expanded coverage of the British handover to China.
Action News will return for you later this morning. Now let's switch to Hong Kong and Good Morning America live. Have a good day.
The Hong Kong handover. A special edition of Good Morning America. Now reporting from Hong Kong, Peter Jennings.
Good morning, everybody. You're looking at one of the most celebrated skylines in the world, Hong Kong, the most dynamic city in Asia. seen from the Kowloon side, very shortly to be rejoined with the People's Republic of China. That's Victoria Harbor, one of the greatest harbors in the world. The British sailed in here 156 years ago and asked for a small piece of land to trade on. They finally got it from the Chinese, and today the Chinese will get it back. Charlie Gibson in New York. It is a great opportunity for us this morning. That's the Royal Yacht Britannia to share Good Morning America with you. Good morning.
The royal yacht on which the Prince of Wales and the Governor of Hong Kong will be leaving Hong Kong fairly shortly. Peter, it's a pleasure to share air with you. I actually look forward to seeing the pictures from there. In this day when so many governments are adopting Western ways, it is extraordinary that we have this robust economic enclave reverting to Chinese sovereignty. This is going to be quite a morning.
It is, Charlie. It's a huge moment in history we're celebrating today. It is, first of all, the end of empire, the end of British colonialism in Asia, but much more importantly, the end, or the realization, really, the realization of a Chinese dream that has been going on ever since the Chinese empire was broken up. 156 years ago, the British came here, and now the Chinese are fulfilling their dream by recapturing this piece of territory, hoping that in time it will lead for them to recapture Hong Kong. It has been a sentimental, a fun and sad day in this very glamorous city. The British certainly know how to say goodbye. This is the 28th and last British governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, saying goodbye at Government House. Chris Patten, the British governor, going 3 times around the circle in front of Government House. It's part of the departure ceremonies. And there's the convention center, which just got finished in time for these celebrations. It is here where the British will hand power for Hong Kong back to the Chinese after all these years. That curved roof, designed by an American architect to replicate the symbol of flight, the flight of birds, not the flight of the British. But it is in the Grand Hall there, behind that British frigate, which will accompany the Royal Yacht Britannia when they leave this harbor, that the Chinese leadership, which arrived just a short while ago in Hong Kong, will take back power. It's a little hard to express at this distance how important this is to the Chinese, but it's also a very big day for the United States. With the British colonial power departing from Asia, the United States stays here. In the 21st century, the United States is now the greatest power in Asia, and how U.S.-Chinese relationships develop out here will very much mark for millions and millions of people exactly how this century goes. We're going to cover this story today from a variety of places. From the United States, with its large Chinese community, 30 to 50 million Chinese living around the world, and of course from the mainland itself. So let's go immediately to Beijing, where ABC's Deborah Wong is standing by, overlooking Tiananmen Square. Deborah, good morning.
Good morning, Peter. Well, right now Beijing is actually Beijing's actually fairly quiet. I was going to say it was very, very noisy and congested this weekend in the place that I'm standing. There were hundreds of thousands of people who basically came out into the streets to celebrate. A lot of them came from all over the country. They wanted to be here at this very important moment for China. Right now, Tiananmen Square is being prepared for the big event tonight. All along the street, there are people sort of filing into the square. They closed it off for a security sweep. It'll be a big extravaganza, lots of fireworks, lots of singing and dancing, and they will watch the event live on TV screens that are set up throughout the square.
Good, Deborah. Well, it's nice to have you here. Are the Chinese people celebrating spontaneously, or are they being encouraged to celebrate?
I think there's two things going on. There's incredible enthusiasm for this event. I think it's impossible to overstate how excited people are. This is a big deal. I mean, for a poor country to be taking back one of the richest territories in the world, I mean, people can't help but be excited. But there is a government propaganda campaign going on. The government is really trying to whip up enthusiasm as well and take credit for what is a big event for China and to give credit to the Chinese leadership.
Okay, Deborah, we look forward to talking to you several times throughout the morning. Tiananmen Square behind her there, which of course is very much at the center of how many people in the world feel about the Chinese taking over Hong Kong, because it was on June 4, 1989 that the current Chinese government, with the exception of the then Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping, cracked down on the pro-democracy movement. And on this departure occasion of the British, it has led many people to wonder what the future of Hong Kong is in terms of political and human rights. One of the issues in which the Chinese have been, at least as seen from Hong Kong, insensitive has been the arrival of the People's Liberation Army. The very army that cracked down in Tiananmen Square was given a very powerful send-off today from the city of Shenzhen, just inside the Chinese frontier, from the new territories of Hong Kong. All three services were represented and were given a send-off by the most senior officials of the Chinese army. They were also told in no uncertain terms that they were supposed to respect the human and the political rights of the people of Hong Kong. If you haven't been following the Hong Kong story, you may not know that an agreement between the British and the Chinese reached in 1984 is supposed to guarantee Hong Kong as it is, a free and democratic place, for 50 years after the Chinese regain sovereignty here. In Shenzhen, one of the new, extraordinarily dynamic new commercial centers of China, there is the People's Liberation Army, the very army that turned on the Chinese people and changed their minds about them at Tiananmen Square. They're coming into Hong Kong in a variety of ways. A little more than 500 are already here, but then 4,000 of them will begin to come from all three services at first light tomorrow. They'll arrive by land, by sea, and by air, and they'll also come in armored personnel carriers in some cases, which has very much upset people not here but around the world, raising this whole question of sensitivity. The Chinese army and the Chinese political leadership has made the point that they're coming here in much lesser force than the British were here, having half the number of men in the garrison as of now, occupying fewer barracks. The ones on the ground here have already had some difficulty getting around, not least of which driving on the left-hand side of the road. That's the Royal Yacht Britannia, familiar to so many of us in so many places around the world. She has traveled more than 1 million miles since she was commissioned in April of 1953. Prince Charles is here to represent the Queen. She's a graceful yacht when she's anchored. Well, let's go back to that, because that's actually a very famous British tradition called the pop concerts. Usually take place in the Royal Albert Hall in London, and they've been brought